best years were spent as an undergraduate and graduate student at Cornell. I don't think we studied much, she would say, closing her eyes and tilting her head as if towards some sweet melody playing in the distance. There were so many other things to do, readings, dinner parties, dances, though I suppose I must have done something. I finished my dissertation, after all. Forgotten Discourse Towards a Definition of Post-Colonial German Literature, a heavy volume contained in a navy blue cloth binding, sits at the bottom of our bookcase, next to a large leather-bound photo album that holds pictures from the same period. Younger then than I am now, my mother had waist-length, stick-straight hair that she parted down the middle. She wore fitted cashmere turtlenecks and tweed knee-length skirts and polished high brown boots. She was really quite lovely. Even today, when age and illness have stripped the flesh from her bones, the luster from her skin, the gloss from her hair, her slanting cheekbones and long cat eyes remain unchanged. In fact, without the other distractions, these particular features seem to exert themselves on the viewer in an act of aggression, both haunting and mesmerizing. My mother always believed that children should never be lied to. I learned about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy from Russell Hoban and the Berensteins, though she did dig around in her purse for $1 each time I lost a tooth. When I asked at the age of 5 or 6 where babies came from, she thought for a moment and said, well, daddies have penises, mommies have vaginas, right there where your wee-wee is. She paused to make sure I understood before continuing. The daddy puts his penis in the mommy's vagina, and here she formed an O with the thumb and first 2 fingers on one hand and inserted her index finger into the O. She went on, and then the daddy shoots his sperm into the mommy, which fertilizes her egg and makes a baby. I said, but why does he do that? She shrugged, because it feels good. My reaction I can no longer recall. I was not a particularly inquisitive child, so I must have concluded that this was another of those situations in which the answer was significantly less interesting than the question itself, and left it at that. In primary 3, I, along with every other girl in my class, developed a crush on Mark D'Souza. Even at that age, he had the wavy brown hair and dimpled grin that, in adulthood, would earn him a place on Her World magazine's list of the 50 most eligible bachelors. Determined someday to marry him, I asked my mother if my father had been her first love, and truthfully, she answered no. Although she and Ba had gone out a few times in secondary school, she didn't fall in love until she went away to America. There she met Matthew Spencer, a New Englander and fellow grad student whom she broke up with after a year because her parents forbade them to marry. By the time of the breakup, 8 years had passed since she and Ba first dated. Nonetheless, when he heard the American was out of her life, he bought a plane ticket from Singapore to New York City, rented a car, and drove the 4 hours north to Ithaca, all against his parents' wishes. The following year, Ma completed her dissertation and returned to Singapore to marry my father, and 10 months later, I was born. The tale of how my parents found love charmed my 9-year-old self. I pictured my father shivering in a brand new wool coat, braving the February snow to rescue my mother and bring her home. Only later, after the American visiting professor had come and gone, did I stop to consider her first American, the man whose departure had brought my parents together. Questions poured into my head. If she'd been so happy in America, why had she agreed to return? Had she truly loved my father? Did she grow to love him? Did she love him still? Over time, many of these answers would reveal themselves, yet the original questions begot others, each more urgent than the one before, a never-ending chain of ever-rising stakes. The American visiting professor was named Colin Clark. He had come from the University of Chicago to give a seminar at my mother's university. To welcome him and his wife, the humanities chair hosted a dinner at a seafood restaurant on the eastern coast of the island that was famous for chili crabs, the unofficial national dish of Singapore. At first, my father tried to get out of going. It was no secret that he found Ma's colleagues exhausting. They sat around discussing books no one else read, and when he tried to bring up something he'd seen in the paper or on TV, they stared at him blankly, as if they had more important things to worry about than the daily news. But all the other spouses would be there, and my mother insisted she could not show up alone. Ba eventually relented, and when, on the night of the dinner, he announced that I was coming too, Ma frowned but did not protest. Most of the meal passed uneventfully. In between lengthy lectures on the history of Singapore cuisine for the benefit of the foreign visitors, food being the one obsession all Singaporeans share, I imagined that Ma and her colleagues would have discussed their research and their classes, that Ba and the other spouses would have quickly run out of things to say and would have spent the rest of the dinner nodding and smiling politely. Every once in a while, a grown-up asked what my favorite subject was in school or whether I was enjoying the food, and other than that, I was left alone. Colin Clark's face I could no longer picture, but I could recall his wife, a frightfully thin woman with poofy hair the color of pomegranates, who complained about the humidity and the spiciness of the food and finally agreed to taste a single morsel of crab before pointedly wiping off her sauce-stained fingers on a disposable towelette. Only one other aspect of that dinner stuck with me. Near the end of the meal, I noticed Ma and Colin Clark discussing some writer or philosopher they both admired. When I glanced back a good while later, it was clear from the tilt of their shoulders and the angles of their head that the conversation was far from over. It was then that Ba threw back the last of his beer and cleared his throat. He leaned over, looped an arm around Ma's shoulder, and began questioning them about their philosopher in a bright, loud voice. And what startled me most was neither his aggressive manner nor the questions themselves, but the way he spoke, peppering his speech with phrases like, "No kidding," and "Sure thing," and "You don't say." My father was mimicking an American accent. His eyes glittered feverishly, and his face and neck burned bright red. Another colleague tried to engage him in a different discussion, but he would not turn away. After that, someone, probably the humanities chair, signaled for the check. The academics and their spouses began to reach for purses and rise from the table. In the car, on the way home, Ba continued to speak in that strange voice, and when Ma told him to cut it out, he widened his eyes and said he had no idea what she was talking about. I had just turned 10, and my parents did their best to hide their distress. All I knew was that one evening, a month or two after Colin Clark's arrival, Ba didn't come home for dinner. The following evening, it happened again. Hours later, when he finally returned, Ma hurried down the stairs. The door to the study swung shut and the arguing began. I lay awake in bed listening for the American's name, never just Colin, always Colin Clark, spoken contemptuously by my father, pleadingly by my mother, and images from that night returned to me. The way Ma had laughed loudly and glamorously at the American's jokes, how at the end of the night his wife had refrained from taking Ma's hand, instead raising her palm in a half-hearted wave, and most of all, Ba's grotesque accent. When the voices grew too loud for my pillow to block out, I got out of bed and ran the faucet in the tub at full blast. There in the warm bath I lay, watching my fingers and toes shrivel as if from old age. On the fourth day, Ba peeked into my room well after midnight, walked through the half-open door of the ensuite bathroom, and found me asleep in a tub of tepid water. The next morning, he dropped me off at my uncle's house, where I was to stay while he and Ma took care of grown-up business. The drive over was the first time we'd been alone together in days, and I didn't tell him I was too old to be spoken to like that. Instead, I asked, "When do you think I'll be able to come home?" "Soon," my father said. "In a few days, Ma or I will be back." But his words disturbed me. Why would only one of them come? Where would the other one be? What would it take to send Ma back to her beloved America? In front of my uncle's house, Ba stretched his lips into a tired smile, and I tried to smile back. As much as I longed to ask these questions, I sensed this wasn't the time and that he might not even have the answers. Thank you.